A small neighborhood restaurant, dim lights, the muted sound of cutlery against porcelain. A man sits alone at a table. He does not raise his voice. He does not reach for help. He does not fall. He simply stops moving. Across the room, no one reacts immediately. Some recognize him. Others only sense that something irreversible has just occurred. The man's name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Harlem knew him by another name, Bumpy. Before this night ended, federal prosecutors were already preparing a case that would dismantle everything he had built. Pause. This is not a legend. This is not folklore. This is the documented story of power, how it forms, how it survives, and how it inevitably draws attention. The question that defines the story. Harlem would later argue over who Bumpy Johnson really was. A criminal, a protector, a necessary evil. But the real question is simpler and more dangerous. What happens when the law is present, but protection is not? The answer shaped an entire neighborhood, and it shaped the man who would come to embody it. Origins, where power first replaced justice. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. The world he entered was rigidly ordered, not by fairness but by race. When Johnson was still young, his older brother was killed after a confrontation with a white man. There was no resolution that felt like justice, no accountability that restored balance, only silence. That silence taught a lesson no classroom could provide. Protection was selective, the law was conditional, and survival required something else. This moment did not turn Ellsworth Johnson into a criminal, but it planted a belief that would never leave him. If power does not exist for you, you must learn how it is created. Harlem, promise built on absence. As a teenager, Johnson was sent north to Harlem. In the early 1920s, Harlem was celebrated as a cultural capital. Music, literature, ambition everywhere. But beneath the surface, the infrastructure of protection was thin. Police presence existed. Trust did not. Harlem in the 1920s posed a dangerous question. What happens when culture thrives, but protection does not? For young men like Johnson, the answer was not philosophical. It was practical. He left school early, but he read constantly: history, philosophy, poetry. He listened more than he spoke. Those who encountered him remembered the same thing. He was quiet, deliberate, observant, in an environment shaped by noise and desperation. That made him noticeable. The name that stopped sound. A physical bump on his head earned him a nickname, Bumpy. At first, it was mockery. Over time, it became something else. The name began to carry meaning, not because of volume, but because of restraint. Johnson did not seek unnecessary confrontation. He did not posture. When conflict occurred around him, it was rarely impulsive, and its consequences were permanent. People remembered that. The economy no one controlled, but everyone depended on. Harlem's most powerful underground system was the numbers racket, an illegal lottery played by working people. Small bets, huge collective sums. It paid rent, bought groceries, kept neighborhoods functioning. This was not chaos. It was structure, and one of its most visible figures was a woman who refused to remain invisible. Stéphanie St. Clair. Educated, outspoken, unwilling to surrender Harlem's economy to outside forces. She understood something the authorities did not. Control does not always come from force. Sometimes it comes from legitimacy. She recognized that Johnson possessed discipline without recklessness, and she brought him close, learning how power actually works. Johnson did not become a symbol overnight. Under St. Clair's influence, he learned the mechanics of informal authority, when to intervene, when to wait, when presence alone was enough. He learned that violence was a tool, not a language. And most importantly, he learned that predictability creates stability. These lessons would define his rise. The numbers war. When Harlem was contested, Harlem's economy attracted attention. Not curiosity, but ambition. Dutch Schultz, a white gangster from outside the neighborhood, sought control of the numbers trade. He did not want partnership. He wanted domination. The conflict that followed was not subtle. Intimidation, shootings, sudden disappearances. But this was not merely a business dispute. It was about who had the right to govern Harlem's survival. While Schultz relied on overwhelming force, Johnson relied on precision, calculated retaliation, information, timing. When Dutch Schultz was assassinated in 1935, the war ended, but its consequences did not. What Johnson could not see yet was how closely his name was now being watched. Negotiation, not surrender. After Schultz's death, Italian organized crime groups moved carefully. They did not attack Harlem. They negotiated. Popular culture would later simplify this moment. Reality was more restrained. Johnson did not rule independently. He did not surrender control. He retained local influence while operating within negotiated boundaries. This arrangement marked a shift. Crime became less visible, more administrative, more patient, and Johnson adapted. The shape of quiet power. By the late 1930s, Johnson had become a central figure, not because he announced himself, but because disputes ended when he intervened. He paid rent for families, helped settle conflicts, ensured predictability. These acts earned gratitude, but they did not erase the violence that made such authority possible. For every dispute resolved quietly, others suffered without record, names absent from court files and headlines. This contradiction followed him everywhere. The myth begins, and the files grow. Stories began to circulate, some true, some exaggerated. Myth has momentum, and momentum attracts attention. Federal authorities began compiling information. Surveillance intensifiée. Names repeated. Johnson noticed the shift. This was the moment the government stopped reacting and started waiting. The shift from street power to state power. Power survives longest when it remains informal. For years, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson understood this instinctively. He did not seek attention. He avoided spectacle. But power, once accumulated, creates patterns, and patterns invite scrutiny. By the early 1940s, Harlem was no longer the only place noticing those patterns. Washington was watching, not with urgency, with patience. Why the government intervened. For decades, local law enforcement had treated Harlem's underground economy as a nuisance. Manageable, predictable, contained. Federal authorities saw something else. They saw structure. Money moved consistently. Violence occurred selectively. Stability existed where chaos was expected. That combination raised concern. It suggested coordination. Federal agencies did not accuse Johnson of inventing Harlem's criminal economy. They alleged something more specific, that he helped maintain it. And maintenance, in the eyes of the state, is authority. From gambling to narcotics. Gambling had long been tolerated as an open secret. Narcotics were different. By the late 1940s, heroin had entered Harlem through international routes beyond the neighborhood's control. The trade was volatile, addictive, and far more visible to federal enforcement. Prosecutors would later allege that Johnson played a coordinating role within Harlem's narcotics economy, not as its architect, not as its sole controller, but as a stabilizing presence. In criminal systems, stability is influence, and influence attracts federal attention. The long investigation. The government did not act quickly. They documented. Years passed. Agents tracked movements, mapped relationships, collected testimony. They waited for consistency. Johnson sensed it. Those close to him later recalled that his decisions became slower. Meetings were shorter. Conversations were quieter. He had survived violence. He had survived rivals. But this opponent did not threaten. It observed. The indictment. In 1951, the waiting ended. A federal indictment was issued. The charge was not symbolic. It alleged conspiracy to violate narcotics laws. A federal offense designed to dismantle networks, not individuals. Johnson did not resist arrest. He did not disappear. He appeared. That choice was not defiance. It was calculation. The courtroom, where power means nothing. The courtroom did not recognize reputation. It recognized documentation. Prosecutors presented testimony from cooperating witnesses, some credible, some compromised. The defense challenged their reliability. But the structure of the case mattered more than the personalities within it. This was not a trial about morality. It was about association. In 1952, Ellsworth Johnson was convicted. The sentence was severe: 15 years in federal prison. Harlem did not react immediately. The absence took time to register. Removal from the system he built. Pause. Power depends on presence. Prison eliminates presence. Johnson was sent through some of the most restrictive federal institutions of the era. Facilities reserved for inmates the system struggled to contain. Inside, he was no longer central. He was just another body, another number. But prison did not erase identity. It tested it. Prison as psychological warfare. Johnson adapted. He read extensively, wrote poetry, studied philosophy. Violence occurred around him, but he rarely initiated it. Incarceration stripped him of territory, but not awareness. He received information through letters, through visitors, through silence where communication once existed. For the first time, decisions were being made without him, and every decision rewrote his relevance. Power does not vanish in prison. It decays. Harlem without him. While Johnson remained confined, Harlem evolved. Younger figures expanded influence. New methods replaced old discipline. Some individuals honored existing understandings. Others tested boundaries. Johnson was not betrayed. He was outpaced. Absence created opportunity. And opportunity does not wait. The cost of waiting. Years passed. The world outside changed faster than the one inside. Johnson aged. His body absorbed the stress of confinement. But the greater cost was invisible. He no longer shaped outcomes. He reacted to them late. Release without restoration. In 1963, after more than a decade in federal custody, Johnson was released on parole. He returned to Harlem quietly. There was no celebration, only recognition. Respect remained, but it was no longer exclusive. The neighborhood had adjusted. The system had moved. A different landscape. Harlem no longer operated on patience. Drugs were more visible, violence less controlled. Johnson observed rather than intervened. He understood something clearly. Force could no longer restore what time had dissolved. Federal attention continues. Federal attention toward Johnson continued intermittently after his release. He was questioned, observed, documented, not because he was dominant, but because he was symbolic. He represented continuity, and continuity concerned the state. The weight of age and memory. Johnson's health deteriorated. Years of vigilance had consequences. Doctors warned him, but warnings did not alter habit. He continued to exist within the margins he knew. The final investigation begins. By the late 1960s, another federal case was forming. It was incomplete, unfinished, but it loomed. Johnson was aware of it. Once again, he waited, the silence that followed power. Return without control. Pause. When Ellsworth Raymond Johnson returned to Harlem in 1963, nothing announced his arrival. No crowds gathered. No territory shifted overnight. No authority reassembled itself around him. The streets recognized his face, but recognition was no longer obedience. Harlem had learned to operate without him, and that reality carried weight. A neighborhood that had moved on. The Harlem Johnson returned to was louder, faster, and more fragmented. The discipline that once governed disputes had eroded. Younger figures moved quickly, not cautiously. Violence no longer waited for permission. Johnson did not attempt to reassert dominance. He observed. He understood something that power rarely admits. Time does not pause for reputation. Symbol, not center. Federal attention toward Johnson continued intermittently after his release. He was no longer viewed as a tactical threat. He was a symbol, a reminder of an earlier structure, one the government believed had already begun to dissolve. Agents followed routines, recorded meetings, asked questions that produced little. Johnson responded calmly. He had answered questions before, a man without a role. In public, Johnson appeared restrained. He spent time in restaurants, spoke with old acquaintances, walked familiar streets. But his influence had changed. People still listened, but they no longer waited. For the first time in decades, Johnson existed within Harlem rather than above it. This was not humiliation. It was displacement. The body keeps score. Years of confinement and vigilance had consequences. Johnson's health declined steadily. Doctors warned of heart complications. Stress had accumulated quietly, but caution was foreign to him. He had lived his life responding to pressure. Now, pressure had become permanent, the shadow of another case. By the late 1960s, federal authorities were assembling another investigation. It was incomplete, unfinished, but existed. Johnson was aware. Once again, he waited. He did not flee. He did not challenge it. Perhaps he understood something others did not. That resistance no longer changed outcomes. The last evening, July 7th, 1968, a warm night in Harlem. Johnson entered Wells' restaurant, a familiar place. He sat down, ordered coffee. There was no tension in the room, no argument, no threat. Witnesses later described him as quiet, tired. Then, without warning, his heart failed. There was no violence, no final confrontation. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson died seated upright, as if refusing collapse. Immediate aftermath. News traveled quickly, but without shock. Some mourned privately. Others said nothing. There was no retaliation, no upheaval. The streets absorbed the absence. Harlem continued. It always had. Burial without spectacle. Johnson was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Around him rested politicians, artists, industrialists. The contrast was fitting. He had lived between worlds, and now he remained there. The problem of legacy. History struggled to categorize Bumpy Johnson. He was undeniably a criminal. He was undeniably influential. Some remembered generosity. Others remembered fear. Both memories were accurate. Johnson did not seek to be understood. He sought stability on his terms. Mythe formation. After his death, stories expanded. Details softened. Motives simplified. Popular culture reshaped him. Heroism replaced ambiguity. Dialogue replaced silence. But records remain less forgiving. They describe a man who navigated inequality not by reforming systems, but by exploiting their absence. What he represented. Johnson's life reflected a specific historical gap, where legal authority lacked legitimacy. Informal power filled the space. This was not justice. It was substitution, and substitution carries cost. For every conflict resolved quietly, others endured violence without record. Names lost to history. Why the story endures. Bumpy Johnson is remembered not because he was exceptional, but because he was illustrative. He demonstrated what happens when survival becomes governance, when order exists without accountability. Final haunting conclusion. Pause. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson did not fall to a bullet. He was not betrayed in an alley. He was undone by time, and by a system that did not need to rush. His story leaves an uncomfortable question behind. What replaces protection when the law cannot be trusted? Harlem answered that question once, and paid the price, because power created in the shadows never escapes the light. It only delays